A high-value woman never shrinks herself to be loved, and this point sits at the core of everything we're talking about in this speech. Because before we even discuss standards, boundaries, or relationship choices, we have to confront a deeper truth. The greatest mistake a woman can make for a man is abandoning herself in the process of trying to keep him. Too many people grow up believing that love requires sacrifice, compromise, and flexibility, and those things can be healthy in the right context. But there is a line most people are never taught to recognize. On one side of that line is healthy compromise. On the other side is self-erasure. A high-value woman knows the difference. She refuses to cross that line. She doesn't reduce her voice to avoid conflict. She doesn't lower her standards to avoid loneliness. She doesn't reshape her personality to appear more easy, more agreeable, or more low maintenance. She understands that the right relationship doesn't require her to become smaller. It requires both people to become better. Psychologically, shrinking yourself for love often comes from fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. When someone fears losing a man more than losing their self-respect, they unconsciously train him to value them less, not because he's inherently cruel, but because human nature responds to what we tolerate. If you tolerate being minimized, you teach others that minimizing you is acceptable. A high-value woman does the opposite. She teaches people how to treat her through the way she treats herself. She speaks clearly. She sets boundaries calmly. She doesn't over-explain, over-apologize, or overcompensate to earn approval. Her confidence isn't loud or aggressive. It's quiet, grounded, and steady. And that steadiness creates respect. She doesn't beg for affection. She doesn't chase someone who is emotionally unavailable. She doesn't stay in situations where her effort is taken for granted, not because she lacks empathy, but because she understands a simple principle. Love without respect eventually turns into resentment. There's also a philosophical layer to this. When someone shrinks themselves for a relationship, they send a message to their own mind that they are less important than the relationship itself. Over time, this erodes self-worth. The person becomes dependent on external validation rather than anchored in internal value. A high-value woman refuses to outsource her self-worth to anyone, not a partner, not society, not even family. She recognizes that her identity is not something to negotiate. Her dreams are not optional. Her time is not disposable. And her values are not flexible just because someone else feels uncomfortable with them. This doesn't mean she's rigid, selfish, or unwilling to grow. It means her growth is intentional, not fear-driven. She evolves because she wants to become wiser, stronger, and more emotionally mature, not because she's trying to mold herself into what someone else demands. There's an important distinction here. Shrinking is not the same as adapting. Adaptation is healthy. Shrinking is self-betrayal. Adaptation says, I can meet you halfway. Shrinking says, I'll abandon myself so you don't leave. A high-value woman never confuses the two. She also understands attraction on a deeper level. Real attraction isn't built on desperation. It's built on presence, self-respect, and emotional stability. When someone is constantly chasing, overgiving, or trying to prove their worth, it signals insecurity. But when someone stands firmly in their own value, it creates natural pull. Not manipulation, just gravity. She doesn't perform for love. She doesn't audition for commitment. She doesn't exhaust herself trying to convince someone to choose her. Her mindset is simple. If someone sees her value, great. If they don't, she doesn't stay long enough to beg them to change their mind. And this isn't about playing games or acting cold. It's about emotional maturity. She can care deeply without becoming emotionally dependent. She can love fully without losing herself. She can walk away without bitterness because she knows her worth doesn't decrease just because someone failed to recognize it. Another mistake many women make is believing they must be endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding, even at the cost of their own mental health. A high-value woman understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. She is kind, but she is not naive. She is understanding, but she is not tolerant of disrespect. She knows that her presence in someone's life is a privilege, not an entitlement. And she doesn't cling to people who treat her like an option. She doesn't rationalize red flags. She doesn't explain away patterns of neglect. She pays attention to behavior, not promises. From a psychological standpoint, shrinking yourself often leads to emotional burnout. You start feeling invisible, unappreciated, resentful, and eventually disconnected from your own identity. A high-value woman avoids this by staying rooted in who she is. She nurtures her own ambitions, friendships, passions, and sense of purpose outside of any relationship. She doesn't build her entire world around a man. A relationship is a part of her life, not the foundation of it. Her foundation is her character, her values, her self-respect, and her long-term vision. And perhaps most importantly, she doesn't confuse intensity with love. She knows that just because a relationship feels dramatic, emotional, or consuming, doesn't mean it's healthy. She chooses stability over chaos, respect over excitement, peace over emotional turbulence. When she enters a relationship, she does so as a complete person, not someone hoping to be completed. She doesn't expect a man to save her, fix her, or define her. She sees partnership as two whole individuals walking side by side, not one person carrying the emotional weight of the other. This mindset naturally aligns with the rest of the mistakes we'll explore in this speech, because once a woman refuses to shrink herself, she also becomes less likely to tolerate inconsistency, chase potential, ignore red flags, or sacrifice her future for temporary affection. Everything starts with this core decision: I will not abandon myself for love. A high-value woman never builds her life around a man's potential, and this point naturally follows from the idea that she refuses to shrink herself for love, because once a woman is anchored in her identity and self-worth, she also becomes far less likely to gamble her future on someone's promises, fantasies, or what-ifs. One of the most common mistakes people make in relationships is falling in love with an imagined version of someone rather than the person standing in front of them. They don't love the man he is, they love the man he could become. They invest in his dreams, excuse his shortcomings, and emotionally commit to a future that hasn't been earned yet. A high-value woman does not live in that illusion. She values reality over hope, patterns over promises, and consistency over charm. She understands a difficult but liberating truth: potential means nothing without action. Almost everyone has potential. That alone doesn't make someone a good partner. What matters is follow-through, accountability, emotional maturity, and effort over time. She doesn't date ambition, she dates behavior. Psychologically, investing in potential often stems from a rescuer mindset. Some women feel valuable when they are the one who believed in him, the one who stayed, or the one who helped him grow. While support in a relationship can be healthy, it becomes dangerous when it turns into emotional labor that replaces the other person's responsibility. A high-value woman refuses to become a rehabilitation center for someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own growth. She doesn't confuse empathy with self-sacrifice. She can care about someone's struggles without making them her burden. She can understand someone's past without allowing it to justify harmful present behavior, and she doesn't feel obligated to stay simply because she sees hidden potential. There's a philosophical depth to this. When someone invests in potential, they are often avoiding the discomfort of accepting reality. It feels more romantic to believe in transformation than to admit someone isn't right for you. But a high-value woman understands that love built on fantasy eventually collapses under the weight of reality. She chooses clarity over delusion, even when clarity is painful. She pays attention to how a man shows up now, not how he says he will show up later. She watches how he handles responsibility, conflict, growth, and commitment. She doesn't stay in situations where progress is always promised but never delivered. Her standard is simple: words matter, but patterns matter more. Emotionally mature people understand that you cannot love someone into becoming better. You cannot motivate someone into responsibility. You cannot sacrifice your future to inspire someone to grow. Growth must be self-driven. A high-value woman recognizes this and refuses to tie her destiny to someone else's unfinished journey. She doesn't wait endlessly for someone to get it together. She doesn't delay her goals, pause her dreams, or put her life on hold in hopes that someone will eventually rise to her level. She knows that time is one of her most valuable assets, and she doesn't spend it on indefinite promises. This doesn't mean she expects perfection. It means she expects effort, integrity, and progress. She's willing to build with someone who is already building themselves, but she won't build for someone who refuses to build at all. There's also a psychological danger in loving potential. It creates emotional attachment to an imagined future. When that future doesn't materialize, the disappointment feels personal. People start thinking, if I just try harder, if I'm more patient, if I'm more supportive, maybe he'll change. A high-value woman steps out of that cycle. She understands that someone else's growth is not her responsibility. She also refuses to confuse loyalty with self-neglect. Loyalty does not mean staying in a stagnant situation. Loyalty does not mean tolerating repeated disappointment. Loyalty does not mean betraying your own standards. A high-value woman knows that being loyal to herself comes first. She chooses men based on demonstrated character, not emotional potential. She looks for consistency, discipline, emotional intelligence, and respect. She doesn't get swept away by